my job today is to introduce Professor Paul Gough. It's a real honour and a pleasure to have him here. He's a dear colleague and friend of mine and also of the gallery. He's a huge support to us. And I think Paul is nothing short of a living evocation of the Duracell bunny. I mean, his energy knows no bounds. Not only is he principal and vice chair of the Arts University in Bournemouth, but he is a prolific lecturer and author with a big emphasis on war art, on which he did his PhD. He's an artist. Check out his Instagram. Some really beautiful, beautiful pictures he has done on that. He is running a project on Paul Nash in Dorset, which again, you can see on Instagram, which is another great enterprise, which I hope you will get to publish one of these days. And he's also running a project with Amy Lim, one of our volunteers and curators here, getting together all Gilbert's works, creating an online monograph. So all in all, you are a busy man. So thank you for coming to see us. Oh, and I forgot, if you are sort of into your TikTok, Paul is actually Banksy, but when I told my children I was going to see Paul Gough, they said, "What, Banksy?" Anyway, Paul, thank you so much for coming to see us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, and for inviting me along to this evening. Some thanks to start with. There have been thanks already, but thanks to all the organisers, Chris and colleagues, and Amanda in particular, for inviting me here, making me feel very welcome, and getting the organisation. I know what the logistics are like. Running a university, most of my job is logistics. I thought the exhibition, the remarkable exhibition, the Robert Wagner show at the moment, I mean, so impressive. Such a brilliant idea, bringing contemporary artists into the gallery. So well done for doing that. I bought some copies of the Holy Box book that we did, and Amanda has done a part of this as well. I'll show 10 slides about this, not just a plug, but because it's the untold story about Stanley and the Berkeley Chapel. It's a great story. A really lovely book to have done, that one. I also bought for free some rather old, but a catalogue of landscape paintings of mine, which I thought just to share with you. And of course, the remarkable Cookham Festival. I mean, there are colleagues in the room here who have been able to put this together. And I was contacted on a few weeks ago by, who's in the room who's organised, who put the organisation of this? Yeah, at the back there. What a job you've done. So I was phoned up and said, can you be free on Star Wars Day, May the 4th? And I said, yes, I can. What time do you want me? He said 2:15 or 12:15. I said, who's on before? And they said, Will Gompertz. And I thought, well, there you go, there's a start. Will Gompertz, and you've got the theatre critic at the Times. I thought they're, showstopper. Then there's me, and then after me is Ross Kemp. I thought, I will be the warm-up act for Ross Kemp. So do come May the 4th. I'll be talking about my other pet subject, which Amanda has just mentioned, and whose name I will not mention. Some special guests here tonight. Extraordinary to have colleagues here who I've known a long time, who have donated. They've let me photograph work for the book. Sir Michael Llewellyn-Smith and his wife Colette, thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything. We've done a lot of work together in the past. Michael, who's a historian of the Macedonian campaign, which I've also published around that subject, and Colette and Michael and I, and my wife, went along and looked at the paintings you have of Gilbert's. They are in the book. And of course to Karen and Kathy, who were mentioned just previously, who we've made contact with. So delightful to have you here, Gilbert's granddaughters. Put your hands up again, because it is so wonderful to have you here. It's deeply moving to have colleagues, and part of writing the book was to make as much contact. The irony, of course, of doing a book is as soon as it's out, and it is out now, can't believe it, other things emerge. That's the nature of the beast, isn't it? There it is. There is one copy in the world, and that is it. The rest are in the depot, or the depot. It's rather chunky. 400 pages, 203 illustrations, 101,000 words, and everything else that you want in a book. And it's good for pressing flowers if you get bored at any point. So at the risk of moving quite quickly, and I do tend to talk fast, so do tell me to slow down or be a bit more measured, and do fire out if there are any questions. What I was going to do is is really a kind of a celebration of, have I done this right? Yeah, here we are. The excitement of searching the archives. For any historian, and I know Kathy's background is a historian as well, going into these places is just so exciting. It's the very stuff of research. And last week I laid out in front of all of my colleagues in the library at my university a chance to see the material that we have related to Gilbert Spencer. We have everything from his passport, medical certificate, a range of material. It is such a privilege to be on the inside of somebody else's life. You must never take it for granted, and you have to treat it with great respect and great honour. What I also was privileged to do, if I take a step back into the Holy Box territory, and just forgive me for 10 or so slides, just to show you the other archive that I was able to access maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. When I was working in Australia, I was able, through the National Trust, to visit the archive of the drawings, the templates, the sketches, the notes, the letters, the photographs of the origination of the chapel. So this is a Stanley Spencer story for a few slides, and then Gilbert and Stanley overlap, and then I'll go into the Gilbert story if you'll bear with me. So here we have the templates of the Holy Box, or the God Box, as Stanley called it, drawn by a remarkable young architect called Lionel Pearson, who worked with Charles Holden. Pearson is an invisible figure in the architectural world, but he had to work very closely with our friend Stanley. And Stanley knew exactly what he wanted to the nth degree. He wanted an undecorated box, thick walls, with deep-set windows. He drew drawing after drawing after drawing, and poor old Lionel, the architect, tried to keep up with him. There were several people in this relationship, and it was not an easy relationship, largely because Stanley wanted something like that was based in Italy, and instead he was faced with a building that would have been right for the 1920s. The archive talks a great deal, and Amanda wrote a chapter for the book on the Berrand family, a remarkable family based in Berkeley, who did so much for young artists and young musicians in the 20s and the 30s. They were the most patient, generous, and thoughtful family possible. And without the chapel, poor old Hal, who was died of malaria as a result of malaria taken several times in the First World War, he would never have had the memorial that the chapel became. And what's interesting about the book, and what's interesting about the whole story, is you realize there are three people in this relationship. The artist, Stanley, you have the architect, and then you have the patrons. And it's a very uneven relationship, because Stanley was Stanley, very specific, very boisterous, very dogmatic, wanted exactly what he wanted, and the Berrands were there to do everything for the painter, and the poor old architect was stuck in the middle. And here's Stanley, as we know, in his military garb, photographed not far from here. It's always amazing to give talks in Cookham, within 100, 150 metres of where these photographs, where these events actually took place. And there's Stanley as a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps, there's Percy as a sergeant, and poor Sydney, who I just went up and look again and pay homage at the War Memorial there, and there is Sydney's name with his military cross after his name. And these are some of the work that Stanley did as a result. This is from the gallery, from the Stanley Spencer Gallery. These are mentioned in the book. The points where Gilbert and Stanley overlap is at this place here, not least as they were brought up clearly in Cookham as brothers, but also when they went off to the war, and they both worked at the Beaufort War Hospital in Bristol, a place I know very, very well. When I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor, I used to look after the faculty that was housed in this building here, and this was an extraordinary place to be as a young man. When Gilbert arrived, he called it that dreadful hospital, that vile tower, he wrote, and described it as menial labour in a uniform. I wrote in the book about it had a kind of whiff of a kind of carbolic grimness. I don't know where I got that phrase from, but it worked at the time. And really it was a very, very tough sort of induction into the world of adulthood for both brothers. A remarkable photograph here, and this is a quote again. Gilbert is such a good commentator on Stanley's practice. Gilbert was such a great observer, wrote an extraordinary book in 1961 about his brother, just as he was grieving for his brother and for the death of his own wife. And yet, what he wrote about the time he was there with Stanley is really quite touching. And this quote here, Gilbert recalled his very first terrifying moments at the Beaufort, when he was surrounded by a ward full of wounded Gallipoli soldiers. Here's a soldier here in his familiar bushwhacker hat there. Soldiers from Gallipoli, their skin sunburnt, their clothes bleached, and the soil, very soil of Gallipoli, Suvla Bay, where I have been, where Michael has been, and others. This is such a powerful evocation of the rawness of injury and the toughness of the environment they were in. Stanley Spencer Gallery has the complete collection of the letters that Stanley wrote to Desmond Chute, who was a godsend for him, based in Bristol, and helped him understand how to make of the war, of the menial labour, something that was much more miraculous. Stanley lost all of his drawings. Very few survived. In fact, hardly anything survived. More survived of Gilbert's. I'll show those in a second. And the other things in the book, and you may not get excited by shopping receipts. I don't normally, especially ones like from Sainsbury's I had yesterday. But what you see from the 1920s and the 30s as the building was being built, as the material was being gathered, we're talking about everything from extraordinary objects that we put together. I love this quote here as well. This is again Gilbert reflecting on the exactitude that Stanley brought to every task. I expect that Pearson found, as I did when Stan used to lecture me about the exactitude necessary when measuring up from the scale drawings, that the scale was very precise. Stan would order canvases to 3/16 of an inch. Can you imagine the craftsman having to work on those? No, quarter of an inch won't do. It's got to be 3/16. So we have in the book and in the archive, which is now locked away back in the National Trust, an entire record of what things cost. So Bill Head, who was builder, decorator and undertaker in Burgh Clear, the list of the expenditure on each part of the painting, that half of the west side walls, £250 that Stanley was painted, and then receipts for everything. And it's quite exciting, not least because you get materials, artist materials, the logs, the coal, the manure for the garden, everything is there. And for historians, for those interested in material culture, it brings the building to life. And that's what the book was essentially about. And I've given a whole lot of copies to the gallery to sell, because I think others ought to kind of experience it. This is Bill Head, a wonderful drawing done by Stanley. This is a record of his activity in the building, and the bill there for £7, 3 shillings. So lots of that material. When Stanley had a spare moment, incredible, in the middle of 6-7 years, up a scaffold, painting in that chapel that many of you will have seen. This is a wonderful drawing of Mercer, the wagoneer who used to pick the materials up from the railway station in the wagon and bring it into Burgh Clear, where it was used to build this remarkable building. And as Stanley said earlier, I was saying earlier on, I've decided the proportions of everything, the length of the building, the height of the roof, the kind of roof, etc. As someone wrote, it's a compromise between design and faith. What Stanley wanted was very specific. What he got was something he wasn't quite happy with, but he was more excited that you opened the door and went inside. Pearson's idea for a built form was very different. Pearson wanted a very, very pitched roof, a very different kind of feel to it, with enclosed spaces for people to sit in, a different sort of almshouse. And Stanley, as always, knew his own mind, ruled them out. As Andy Daniels wrote, truly the architecture had become the handmaiden of painting. And other photographs that are in the book, never seen before. This is an astonishing image here. You can see the flash from the light has distorted the end wall, the resurrection of the soldiers. These are two of the workmen taking down some of the ladders. And then you have another photograph here of the building as it was even before the painting was put in place. And again, more photographs and paintings that Stanley did a little later on, which show the construction of the lunettes and the framework that was done for them. And there we are. There's the Proud Man, 1930. It was finished actually in 32, but by 1930 he said, having committed to staying in Burgh Clear forever, he said, had enough of Burgh Clear and going back to Cookham, and off he went. It does rank, I don't know if any of you know the 1,000 Best Churches, the book by Simon Jenkins. Some of you may dispute the 1,000 churches, but in the book it talks about this church and the interior of this church ranking alongside Owen, Sassoon, Benjamin Britten as one of the great icons of the First World War. And to finish on Stanley's story and move on to Gilbert, had the privilege in 2017, came back from Australia for the month, and there's me pontificating as I want to do. I think Amanda is in there. The other contributors are there: Sarah, who wrote the history of the garden; James, who wrote a beautiful chapter around the service set, and Carolyn wrote the most gorgeous entry to the book, and Unity and Sharon are there, and John and Gillian came along as well. So a moving moment to be surrounded by family and colleagues. So the link into Gilbert. Gilbert came along regularly to see Stanley painting up the scaffold, and as always, the relationship they had often didn't need many words, and I think this is such a great phrase and a great piece of writing really from Gilbert. I won't read every single word, but what it essentially is saying, there weren't many words they used. Often it was gestures, nods, winks, kind of, pointing at things. I love this thing here. You remember, Gil, said Stanley, those rolls of barbed wire we used to carry. He was carrying one above his head when the strut broke, and it poured right through him. And Gilbert said, Stanley would put his finger across his mouth, characteristically when drawing my attention to the lovely shape of this and of that and the other. And Stanley, apparently, before he started painting, a bit like Gilbert, wouldn't talk profusely before the painting, and very, very little afterwards. So I think it's really quite striking, is this moment when Gilbert would comment on Stanley's work. So, you forgive me for 10 slides to plug that book, but also to tell a story that really hasn't been told very often. It's the backstory. And let's move on to about 30 slides. So forgive me if we go quite quickly, because I want you to get a sense of what's in the book, but also an untold story. In 2014, I wrote a book about John Nash and Paul Nash, and two brothers working very closely together, but very different from each other. And John Nash has emerged as an artist in his own right. The relationship between Gilbert and Stanley is somewhat different. And I could almost write a lecture, and we were going to write the book opening up in the first chapter about Gilbert and Stanley. And I wrote it, and I sent it out to people to read, and colleagues like Carolyn and Amanda wrote back and said, it needs to be Gilbert's stories, not Stanley. Gilbert needs to come out from the shadows. He didn't need to, he did it himself, but his history's not been quite kind to him. And so in a sense, this story is to say that you know so much about the background of the family. There are colleagues in the room here who'll know much, much, much more about this extraordinary family of 9 children, Pa and Ma. There's so much to say, there's so much been written, but you can just see in the kind of body language, there's Stanley, and here's a rather cocksure Gilbert, the youngest by 13 months of Stanley, and yet there's something already kind of ready for the world. There's an extraordinarily beautiful drawing, which I saw when I visited Gillian in 2010, and she had it there, and it just jumped off the wall. This is a young Stanley drawing his brother. It's a showstopper, isn't it? You have to look at that and nothing else, because it is such a sensitive, beautiful drawing. And Stanley could do these, and Gilbert was watching and learning fast. And here's a drawing that Gilbert did many, many years later as a recollection of the moments in 1897 when he and Stanley were dressed up at the beginning of the celebrations of Queen Victoria's Jubilee or Diamond Jubilee. And that phrase there is so wonderful, isn't it? That Gilbert regarded Stanley and he chief friend and companion. You know, when they were put to bed up in their bedroom, listening to music that would just change their worlds. And that companionship comes across so powerfully, so movingly in the first half of the book. The book and the archive, we were able to put together so much material no one has seen before. These are small sketches done as juvenilia of other recollections, and Amanda's written beautifully about these in the book. And look what was happening to him while Stanley was going off to the Slade and doing his voyage into his own kind of world of being the most extraordinary artist. Gilbert wasn't prevaricating, but it was a faltering start as a young man. No one was quite sure what Gilbert was going to do, and the big question in the Cookham-Fernley household was, what are we going to do with Gilbert? What are we going to do with Gilbert? He went to the Ruskin School in Maidenhead for a year. He went off to Camberwell to study wood carving. He went to the wood carving school at Thurlow Place in South Kensington, feeling his way, partly because he was very good with his hands. He was very good at making. He was very good at articulating in 3 dimensions, especially wagons and carts, which stayed with him his whole life. But when he was admitted to the Slade, and we have in the archive this here, this is the receipt for his £5, 5 shillings. They couldn't afford to send him full time, so he went 2 or 3 days a week. And I have those in the collection. They're reproduced in the book here. The acceleration in his development as a draftsman and as a painter is extraordinary. This painting here, The 7 Ages of Man, now in the Gallery of Hamilton in Ontario, in Canada, is just a step in the direction he probably could have least expected. And his professor Tonks told him not to get too big ahead, because he could see that Gilbert was following fast in terms of Stanley Spencer. And I think what's interesting in the first 10 or so years is this idea that Stanley was on a trajectory and Gilbert was somehow kind of falling behind. It wasn't like that. Stanley was constantly looking over his shoulder. And that's a constant refrain. You can see at the top right there is one of the, that says the second drawing from life that he did. And there's a study on the right-hand side for one of the figures in this remarkable picture here. At the bottom, if you can't quite see it, I'll read it out. Gilbert used to make little wooden carts and wheelbarrows and things like that. And he never missed the proportion, which was always accurate. I mention this detail because you'll see in this painting that the elevator, which goes across the picture, has not only been painted, but been built. And that was Stanley's observation of this remarkable painting, that Gilbert had a way of understanding built form, especially agricultural built form, that stood him in good stead for many, many years. And as always, Stanley had come out the Slade, and then the war had come along. Gilbert was halfway through his period at the Slade, and along came the war. And as we know, First World War disrupted so many lives, so many young lives in many, many ways. Gilbert went to Bristol. He served as a medical orderly. It didn't transfigure him in a way that you certainly saw it did for Stanley. But Gilbert, his sense of jocularity, his sense of conviviality, his ability to make friends with people, to be relaxed, was so different the way that Stanley responded to the hospital. Gilbert was sent overseas, and he worked in casualty clearing station in Salonika, and then he was sent off to Egypt, and then he became a medical orderly on this Red Cross ship here, and went to and fro, Alexandria, Gibraltar, Malta, backwards and forwards. He loved the work. He was often in charge of some very serious cases, and he was given a lot of authority. But there's a letter here from 1918, and the first paragraph, "I'm very sorry," writing to Florence. Florence was a sister living in Cambridge that became the family postbox. Everyone wrote to Florence. Florence was the person that everything seemed to pass through. "I'm very sorry if you think that I've forgotten you, but just now I am having a very unhappy time." Like, just so moving. He was deeply unhappy for a lot of the time, thought he was kicking his heels, wasting his time, and gaining very, very little from his experience in the war. When Peace Day came in 1919, whereas Stanley just got on with his painting, Gilbert was outside being angry. He was very angry. He felt like he'd been frustrated. He went back to the Slade, but he felt he'd lost 2 or 3 years. But, extraordinarily, at the age of 27, he was commissioned by the British War Memorials Committee run by Beaverbrook at the Ministry of Information, and he was commissioned to do this remarkable painting of the new arrivals in the hospital in Sinai. And it's not full of merit, but it's certainly, again, a statement of intent. We have in the collection a series of studies that he did for it, squared-up studies, again, very methodical, straight out of the Slade School. And unusually, because Stanley kept none of these, we have sheet after sheet of small drawings of some of the local characters seen around the souk and the like. But for a painting of a young artist emerging in his mid-20s, when all the other artists who were commissioned, Augustus John and Singer Sargent and William Orpen, all in their established 40s and 50s. So rather impressive in the Imperial War Museum. Came back to Cookham, as did Stanley, to think what to do next. He finished at the Slade, and what next? This is a painting that is going to be in the show, Amanda, isn't it? Very much like the painting that Stanley did, which showed what he did before the war and then finished after the war. This is the same. Gilbert came back and completed the painting, almost as if the First War had not existed, but came back again and finished Sasha's Meadow. And it's again another declaration of intent. of where he was going to go as a painter. I think it's a wonderful painting, very impressive. Is now in the Tate Gallery. This ability to paint tonally in that very kind of chiaroscuro way, but also typical of Gilbert's sense of composition, often uses very powerful senses of foreground space, of refuges, of being surrounded with a panorama or a reach or a prospect that he is entirely in control of. I'll show you some others in a short while. But what really happened, I think, and again, a turning point for him, I'd say it was one of the first turning points for his life, was he was invited by Henry Lamb, and the role played by Henry Lamb in the Spencer family must never be understated. In fact, it's one of the exhibitions yet to be done in some ways, is Lamb and the Spencers. Henry Lamb invited Gilbert and Stanley to Dorset, not far. I was driving through it last week at Stourpayne, Durweston, around Melbury Abbas, around there. And Gilbert, something just clicked. He sensed that he was there in his element. There was something about being outside on plein air, single touch painting, and it worked for him. 1919, 1920, Stanley got frustrated but he knew he was good at what he was doing in terms of landscape painting, but he wanted to come back to Cookham. He turned and came back to Cookham to live out his imagination here. Gilbert decided not to come back. And there was a moment, again, one of 6 or 7 key moments that we identify in the book that say this is the moment where Gilbert became his own man. And Henry Lamb is on record as saying to Stanley, "Watch out, Stanley, the little un's catching you up." And you think Stanley was already on this trajectory, and yet all the time thinking, Gilbert can do this better than me. I better watch what's happening here, because they might have been friends, they loved each other, but the book exposes they were rivals in many, many ways. I think it's really quite interesting how that relationship. But it clicked in Dorset. Of course, Gilbert was still making these extraordinary paintings. I still think he was trying to find his voice. He'd certainly had the ABC. He knew the grammar of painting. He knew the diction of drawing. He was taught that by Tonks and by Brown and by Russell. He was taught how to draw, taught how to look. He was trying to unleash his imagination. His imagination was extraordinary. This amazing painting done just before the First World War or during the war was just an amazing kind of image of family sacrifice. They were also extraordinarily well connected, and I do love this painting here, this photograph here. What was so amazing about Pa Spencer is his ability to attract in the great, the good, the glamorous, the shape makers of British society at the time. Here's Lady Ottoline Morell, one of the key figures in terms of the cultural set of the 20s and 30s. And there's Sidney, Pa, Stanley, and Gilbert. Again, you can see the difference in height between Gilbert and Stanley, and relaxed in that kind of company. Finding his way. If you think he's found his voice, how is he trying to find his way at this point? A series of portraits, a stunning drawing, almost like set for practice, set to go out into the world, set to be drawing outside, set to be at one with agriculture. And that's one thing that comes across very strongly in the research and through the book, is Gilbert's affinity with the working man and the working woman, but primarily with the agricultural labourer. He felt very, very kind of convinced that these were individuals who needed to be recognised through painting. And his painting is suffused with that language of honesty and industry that he saw in the labourer. A self-portrait in the I think National Portrait Gallery. And the photograph, I think, tells us a lot about a young man in his mid-20s trying to establish who he is in the world, how he relates to others. This is him at Garsington Manor. So he was offered, after one of the Goupil salons, Ottoline Morell, who befriended hundreds of artists and brought them in, and writers, and brought them into the manor in Garsington. They would gather at weekends. And weekends must have been extraordinary in Garsington Manor, because you'd have T.S. Eliot over there, you'd have Keynes, the economist, over here, you'd have W.B. Yeats, maybe D.H. Lawrence. You'd have these amazing people. In the middle would be Gilbert trying to think, am I of these people? Can I mix with these people? Do I feel comfortable with them? Or do I have to pretend by dressing up in +4s and looking like them? So I think there's a kind of identity moment that's happening here with Gilbert, that he painted portrait after portrait, photograph after photograph. So he had it, and he was gaining it, and then lost it. Now this is quite contentious, And I feel even more delicate saying this, not least with Kathy and Caroline here, because there is a side story. As always in families, there are ghosts, there are side stories. This is Hilda. We know Hilda. We know the Hilda story very well. We know the Hilda story and Stanley. We know the fact that Stanley was engaged to and broke off the engagement 5 or 6 times. An unrequited love affair, which eventually was requited. Very complicated and colourfully so. Picked up by the press, picked up by, for the wrong reasons, the wrong stories, but it is a story. Ironically, it was Gilbert that knew Hilda first and knew her better. And they were, to use the phrase, walking out. They were kind of familiar with each other. Along comes Stanley and is just, as we know, besotted by Hilda. He writes beautifully, elegantly, and wantingly about Hilda. There comes a moment not far from here where there is a tussle of sorts carried out in a brotherly kind of way, and Stanley comes out and says, "She prefers me. She prefers me," or words like that. If I've written down here, she prefers me. It's me, not you, basically. So Gilbert, the younger brother again, only by 13 months and nearly a foot taller, still recognises that the elder brother has had his moment, and Hilda and Stanley are going off in their direction. Gilbert takes it like a brother who loves his other brother but knows that he's slightly slighted and hurt. He, in his autobiography and in his letters, it becomes very, very fuzzy, very vague of what happens for the next period of time. He goes off to Caversham, to Reading. He camps out in a home. Not unusually, they moved around a lot. They're very peripatetic during that period, artists, moving endlessly. And I think he had 18 lodgings before he eventually got married in 1930. 18 different homes that he moved around in. He stayed in the house with Tom Nash, a painter who had been at the Slade with Stanley, and Mabel, the wonderful Mabel. There was an affair, and 9 months later, Peter was born, Peter Spencer Coppock. In the middle of the summer, Stanley and Richard, or Sydney, come along, one of the car lines, pick up Gilbert, incredulous that what's happened, and pull him away, saying, "We're taking him away for a painting weekend." He never goes back. Mabel is banished into a kind of penury. The story is not a great story, and Gilbert's history of his relationship with the family, or his family that he always wants to kind of put to one side, is not a very, very kind of a pleasant story, because biographies reveal a whole range of kind of stuff that goes on. It goes on in all our families, but this is quite interesting, and it's deeply sad. I'll touch on it again, but there's a moment where he, to a degree, lost it. He only lost Hilda, but he lost a whole side to being who he was going to be, and you can see that a bit in the Garsington photographs. Here's a great image, you see. So we have a wonderful photograph here of the landed gentry here. Their names are across there. Extraordinary kind of range of people who would have felt at home, completely at home in Garsington and in the manor. And there's Gilbert. And if anything tells you about someone posing, or the body language of someone sitting down and saying, "Am I comfortable in this space? Do I feel familiar with these people? Do I feel at home?" Well, actually, he did to a degree, because he was then at the time very, very close to Julian Morell, the daughter of Ottoline, and the letters are very full of friendliness and warmth. In fact, what's interesting about Gilbert at that time, he had not quite a harem, but he knew a lot of young women, was very popular, very sociable, and outgoing. But it's quite an interesting painting, a photograph in many ways. But up here is one of Gilbert's paintings. There's a version of that painting there. So it tells you two things at the same time, doesn't it? Being relaxed enough to be in that company, they are buying his paintings. He has patrons, he has sponsors. And he's starting to stretch his wings. Garsington, working in Oxford at the Ruskin School of Art, painting back in Dorset, endlessly peripatetic. And in Hampstead, he's now with the Carline family, the dynamic Carline family. Caroline has written so much about this extraordinary atmosphere around the Vale of Health, around Downshire Hill, the sheer excitement of being amongst convivial literary and artistic company. But look at what's happening to his painting. It's almost like stepping in leaps, making these big assertions. It's a Garsington roofs. Deep thanks to Bonhams. All the auction houses were very, very generous when we were putting this book together and gave me high quality images. to use. This is such a sophisticated painting. I don't know any other artist who can manage that range of pinks and warm ochres and oranges. There's something of the feel here of the wonderful painting that Stanley did of the procession. What is it? With the moonlight falling across the centre of Cookham in the what's the painting I'm thinking of? The Christ going through the centre of Cookham. Is that the one, Carolyn? It says, carrying the cross with the light, the moonlight, and there's a sense of moonlight in here that's, I think, rather beautiful. So yes, his painting was developing rapidly, not only landscape, but doing many photographs of portraits, wonderful portraits. These are the Harter sisters here. This one is in Hull. This is in a private collection. This is going to be shown next week when I'm up at the Lake District. But his ability to capture not just likeness, but something of the stolidity of a figure, nearly always looking to this side. And this is Joyce Peters. Ursula, his wife, wrote many years later that Joyce was the wife he never had. He always wanted to marry Joyce Peters. And Ursula kind of got used to this and thought, fair enough. Joyce became the godmother to Gillian. And much later in her life, Gillian spent a lot of time looking after Joyce with powers of attorney, etc. But again, a rather extraordinary series of portraits. There are many like this. And this one here represents Joyce in between. She was a ballerina, a ballet dancer, and went off to the States, again leaving Gilbert feeling somewhat spurned. We're now in the late 20s. And this is the atmosphere that he picked up on when he was in Hampshire. And I think this is rather a lovely set of phrases here about the kind of person he had become as a young adult, now in his late 20s. Convivial companion, charming, conversational, easygoing, but also extraordinarily animated in company. I can't remember him, this is one of his ex-students wrote, I can't remember him ever being still. A restless energy always seemed to possess him. And when he came into a room, he strode in as if there was nothing half-hearted about him. I think such a powerful idea of what both the brothers must have been like. Fond of dressing for dinner, every effort to entertain his guests, long meals, recitals on the piano. I love this section here. I'm sure I wrote this somewhere. He performed well with an air of carefree competence and adored the music of Mozart, whereas Stanley preferred Bach, which he played slowly and carefully with great clarity, as if thinking through each note. Apparently he sat on the edge of the seat to play his Bach, whereas I think Gilbert was much more flamboyant. The gift of a raconteur, always a centre of attraction in our studio gatherings. And there's the famous painting, which is actually now in Hull. Gilbert isn't in that painting, but you get a sense of the kind of the crowd that were gathered around there. And at the top there, Gilbert felt acutely bereft when he was allowed just to be in the house on his own, but when everyone had left. And the painting of the empty terrace tells us a lot about his attachment to that place, to those people, but also his sense, I think, of where am I in the world now? Am I looking for a partner? Very much looking for a partner. The language he was developing as a painter, these are two of the paintings, again, that are going to be shown. This one on the right is going to be shown next week when we're up in the lakes. Done on plein air in Garsington, working in the classic single-touch painting style he was shown at the Slade, painting, mixing the colours on the palette and then applying them, but very little after painting. He was scrupulous about painting outdoors, but never retouching or refinishing in the studio. And it tells when you see the paintings, they have a kind of an authenticity and honesty of a sense of place that's very, very powerful. I mentioned earlier on about this sense of refuge, the sense of chiaroscuro, the sense of comfort that sometimes he brought to his paintings. The one on the left there in the Ashmolean. He was also an extraordinary painter of agricultural implements, of machinery, not least because, as I said earlier, he was able to understand them, to physically know how they were made. He could actually make them, he could identify each part. This is in an Aberdeen Art Gallery. That's in a private collection. Again, they made it available to me. And I think those three paintings there tell us something about his maturing style, where he was comfortable. But you can also see in a painting on the right, which is the National Trust painting, done on a commission for T.E. Lawrence at Clouds Hill, where he felt very uncomfortable. He didn't care for large exposed open spaces, not least if there were tanks roaming around, because this is done near Bovington, down where the tanks were T. Lawrence was based as in the Royal Regiment, Tank Regiment. And I think Gilbert wrote very convincingly, and in my archive, we have paper, version after version after version of his autobiography, which I've been able to do comparisons with, and he writes disparagingly about having to work in Egdon Heath, famous from Thomas Hardy, of course, and he just didn't care for these vast amounts of space. And at one point he says that one of the saplings was knocked over by a roaming tank that ran across it, knocked the tree down, but the tank went past and the tree sprang back up again. I think this picture tells us so much. In 1930, well, in the late mid-20s, he came to know Ursula. Ursula had been a student at the Ruskin, and he came to know her and he fell in love and got married in 1930. There is a remarkable photograph. It's in Ken Popel's book. Again, in terms of body language, and I'm not saying body language account for everything, I can't vouch for it, but there's something about there's a pride there, here. There's also a pride here, but there's as much of this glance. The light has rather obscured Gilbert's face there, not too much, but you can see this kind of look across at the brothers, both in a sense of triumph, a sense of mutual respect, but also something about brotherly ownership. It's a very curious photograph. This is Florence, the remarkable Florence. So we have Stanley and Hilda, Florence, Ursula, and Gilbert in this little quintet there, which tells us so much. And there's the wonderful Ursula, who played such a major part in bringing a kind of stability to the peripatetic life that Gilbert, at that time, as I said, 18 different residences until 1930. I'll touch very briefly on the relationship there between the brothers, which most of the time was harmonious, but there were times of great tension. And this story here, 6 years after that photograph was taken, in July 36, Dudley Tooth, major figure in British sales and art gallery dealership, invited Gilbert to join his stable of contemporary artists, saying that he could materially increase your sales. Gilbert was really keen. He needed it. Goupil's had just closed down. He was selling his work, but a dealer like Dudley Tooth was huge. So for any painter, Dudley Tooth's gallery promised esteem, recognition, benefit, and reward. But it was not to be. The offer was promptly blocked by Stanley, and I do have the letters. I have the letters annotated by Gilbert in a rage, writing across them. 6 days after his invitation, Tooth wrote rather sheepishly, and I don't get the impression that Tooth was very good at kind of winding things back. A very, very good businessman who looked after Stanley very, very well, but there were difficult relationships between artist and dealer. And Tooth wrote claiming that he told you at the time that it was subject, of course, to not upsetting your brother. So poor old Gilbert, seething, it's a good plan, you should both show at the same gallery. So Gilbert, irked. I think this is another moment, a pivotal moment. And across the bottom here I write, Gilbert made light of Tooth's volte-face, but he acknowledged later that the rebuff created a crisis in my affairs that left its mark on me for life, and scribbled in Gilbert's hand across Tooth's original letter were his most bitter thoughts rendered real. And that's both the fascination, the beauty, and the discomfort of having an archive where you can see at first hand what's been written. And this is part of what he wrote. The whole of this was organised by Stan under the influence of the abominable Patricia Priest. I'm sorry if anyone's related to Patricia. This is somebody else saying this. I never complained of his coming to Goupil. There was none of the dangers which he feared, and as he himself first suggested, that I should join Tooth. A lot of rancour in there. And Ursula plays her part in this as well. So Ursula steps in, and this is a letter to Florence. Very heartfelt. I think his utter neglect of Gil does hurt Gil rather. He, meaning Stanley, never asked him to his private view. Then there was this row over the galleries, which ended well, but since then Stan never replied to Gil's telegram about Gillian, or to his letter asking him and Priest. So this little sort of ding-dong toing and froing that goes on. She pleads with Florence, please don't mention this if you write to me, but if you ever saw Stan, you might put out a feeler very carefully. And there are several words redacted. I know what those words are. I'm not going to repeat them here, but it really is what was the family view of what was going on in Stan's chaotic domestic life. So yes, very protective of Gilbert. I'm not sure he needed it because he was very assertive in his own right, but at the same time, very protective, and Ursula plays a part in that. Ursula here a wonderful drawing done December the 31st, 1931, a year to the day after they were married at Holy Trinity Church in South Kensington, with John Nash as the best man. Apparently very nervous John Nash, nearly dropped the ring and was really kind of surprisingly tense about the whole thing. And then 6 years later, 5 years later, sorry, we have the birth of Gillian. Peter, by this age, was 14 years old. So far, Gilbert has not claimed paternity, has had as little as possible to do with Peter, despite the fact that Peter comes from his school, where he's in Oxford, and stays with them in the farmhouse and in their weekend cottage. Ursula plays a huge part in rehabilitating Peter. She reaches out. She never meets with Mabel, as far as I know. Perhaps I'll be told differently. But she reaches out and she builds that loving bond. And Peter writes later in his life about the value that Ursula brought to his childhood, unlike Gilbert, who didn't want to know. It doesn't present Gilbert in a very favourable light whatsoever. But I just wanted to show those images there, and also that tension between the two of them. Extraordinary time for Gilbert, though. Marriage brings stability, it brings a flat in West London, it brings a set of contacts, and he paints what is probably one of his most important paintings. And this is going to be at show in the coming exhibition that Amanda and colleagues have curated. And this is a Cotswold farm. And I think it's a painting that takes time to study, it takes time to understand. And I spent ages looking at it thinking, what is going on? What is actually going on in this painting? Because it looks like a crash, literally, between a cart and a wagon. But in the book, I talk about the fact that Gilbert knew exactly what he was doing. The painting is it's a celebration of the power of manual labourers who know their craft extraordinarily well. They know how to bring two vehicles close together. They know how to manage horses. The tendency when you look at it is to think the white horse and the white horse are joined together, and they're moving in that direction, and the brown horse with the blue wagon is cutting across them. That's the logic of it, but the pictorial logic is exactly the opposite, because actually these two horses are part of this blue wagon, and this cart is coming from the left. But it plays all sorts of tricks on you. And compositionally, it's absolutely sophisticated. I write in the book about the way the arrangement of the shapes around the outside, the interlocking triangles, the use of the white birds throughout. There's no painter in the 20th century who could paint chickens and hens and cockerels. And he's written up by much better writers than me as being the painter of chickens and cockerels and hens. He was also very interesting about his rendition of labourers, because in a painting like this, at this scale, it took him a long time, many months of labour in his flat in West London. Not one of the figures is looking at you. Normally, the eyes of a large figure, obviously, and the eyes of one of the people would catch the viewer. The viewer would be in and moving around the painting. It's a classic Italian Renaissance principle of it bringing you into the painting. All the figures in here are looking away, looking out, looking wantonly or wistfully into a mid-distance. It's a commentary, I think, of the sensitivity that Gilbert brought to his understanding of labour, but also the plight of English, maybe British agriculture at the time, which was going through one of its periodic crises. Farming didn't pay, mechanisation was coming in, and there were huge challenges. But it was phenomenally well received. No fewer than 6 national papers. In fact, we have in the archive an entire scrapbook. When I inherited it, or when it was given to us, the newspaper cuttings came in lumps, literally lumps. It was the kind of stuff you'd put on as kindling on a fire. And I had to extract them, iron them flat. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, but I did anyway to get them flat. There was one here where he'd put them all together in a scrapbook, all of his references to a Cotswold farm. He was so personally proud, and the press recognised it. Not least did they reproduce it a great deal, but it ended up being bought from the summer exhibition at the Academy by the Chantrey bequest and straight into the Tate. Stanley was moved to distraction. He was in Cookham, would go down past the local shop and could see nothing but reviews of Gilbert. He was, as he wrote, I was brothered of. Oh, you're the brother of Gilbert Spencer. Oh, you're the brother of Gilbert Spencer, aren't you? He's done fantastically well. And Stanley spent the day wandering around thinking, oh my goodness, Gilbert's pulling ahead of me again. I remember this at a time when Stanley was also in his domestic crisis. He'd left Berkeley. He was still riding very, very high, but there was a moment again where a painting like this took Stanley by surprise to a degree, but he also hugely proud. There's something there thinking, yes, this is a massive achievement. It was also picked up, I was sharing this with Amanda recently, Punch magazine used it. You know, you've become famous when Punch magazine start to parody, contemporary art. So this is why farming doesn't pay. So the big debate about the agricultural poor, about food security, it's a familiar conversation we're having now, aren't we? But Punch reproduced it very briefly there. I must say I was given a huge amount of help by the wonderful Museum for Rural Life of England at Reading University, who know more about these wagons. And there are different wagons for different counties, sometimes different sorts of wagons inside each county. And Gilbert knew all about them. At the same time as looking at what you'd expect as being not so much predictable, but landscapes, portraits, and big compositions, there's a strain of Gilbert's work that I wrote about in the book that I still find perplexing and difficult to tell you about. Single figures, the young girl at Garsington walking through a landscape, drayman here, frequent paintings. This one's called The Kind Father. Is that what The Kind Father? This is Mr. Bartlett, the gardener. I think there's an element of conscience playing a part there of his relationship with his son. And then a painting which seemed to cause an enormous amount of problem in terms of his estate and the role of the executor and how much it was worth, the Boy the Rabbit. But there's a whole series of paintings that he did during that period which are so cryptic, so enigmatic, they suggest a whole other dimension to Gilbert's practice. And the role of fences, barbed wires, partitions within the compositions tells you something about security, insecurity, of ways into and out of paintings. I don't offer much more than a few images there, which we reproduce in the book. The fame of a Cotswold farm brought him a lot of attention. He was commissioned to do a large mural in Oxford at Holywell Manor, and produced a series of rather wonderful murals that go around the upstairs of this room on the right-hand side here. By this time, he'd also been given a job at the Royal College of Art. Again, his reputation was big. He taught at some of the biggest art schools at the time. I love this photograph here. Neil Parkinson at the Royal College of Art was very helpful, giving me access to their archive. This is, I've gone back again, apologies. This is a photograph of what they call the mural studio. I mean, there's 10 people painting in a corridor. I'm very impressed by that there. Royal College of Art, there he was as a professor. And this is a fantastic painting, photograph taken by Peter of Gilbert at work in his murals here. Gilbert, again, very competitive. After he'd done 3 murals, this one, he did one for the Royal Academy and one for at Birkbeck College. He would say, I've done 3 murals. Stanley only ever did 1. So again, there was a bit of kind of pushback there. Moving on, he had at that time, with the money from those murals, bought Tree Cottage. He'd invested in property. And there's a moment one of the chapters where we start, that Gilbert had a pang of conscience that he was being regarded as being, by Stanley, who still resented him for not coming back to Cookham. Stanley resented the fact that Gilbert was now acting like landed gentry. He had a house, he had a big job in London, he had a family, and he was definitely, flying high. And there's an element that Stanley was kind of jibing at Gilbert, and Gilbert was very kind of reactive, saying, just because I have these things doesn't mean I've lost my integrity as an artist. But a series of paintings around Tree Cottage. I do love this painting. I couldn't find the original. This is from a 1958 reproduction in the Royal Academy Illustrated. But here we have Gillian in the pram, and there's young Peter there at the table with the family. And this one's called Good Night, Mr. Bartlett. This is the painting of the gardener again. So very, very wonderful to have this house, just the house he had south of Shaftesbury, and then the other one near in Twyford in Dorset. And there are colleagues here, Michael particularly would have gone there for singing, choir, Christmas events. You'll know these places very, very well. There are others here who may well have taken part. The domestic bliss that he experienced as a young married man is exemplified really by the Christmas cards, by the greetings cards. I have copies of all of them. I even have some of the original blocks that were rescued, and I've done prints from those blocks, and they print today as they would have done in the 30s. So every year we had a series of prints showing both the domestic bliss, but also these Christmas messages that he put out. Beautiful objects to have, and they also refer back to his time in Cookham as a child. And there's Ursula and Gilbert on the right-hand side there looking dab together. Along comes the war. It's always a war that kind of disrupts. This one did more damage in some ways than the First World War, partly because by this time Gilbert was an eminent professor at the Royal College of Art. And the Royal College of Art, 1939, the phony war came along. No one knew quite what was happening. They'd closed the colleges, they'd closed a lot of the institutions. In 1940, the then principal of Rodenstein had left Jowett. There's Rodenstein, the principal at the time, decided they had to evacuate, and they went to Ambleside in the Lake District. Extraordinary to take a college all the way up to the Lake District, but they did. Gilbert joined the Land Defence Volunteers, then the Home Guard, enjoyed it thoroughly apparently, and did some most beautiful drawings, was commissioned to make some drawings of some of the some of the heroes and some of the medal winners. The one in the middle there is, I think, a very, very, very fine picture. And here's Gilbert down here, if you can just about see him, in his gown and his hood, and there's the wonderful William Rodenstein at the back of the Exhibition Road studios at the Royal College of Art by the V&A, where I indeed also, when I was a student at the Royal College, my studios were there as well. And there they are. They landed in Ambleside. I mean, what's the population of Ambleside? You know, a couple of thousand, not 1,000 people, I imagine. Along comes hundreds of art students. And they were put up in two hotels. The Salutation, not a great name for a hotel, and the Queen's Hotel. And they stayed there for the duration of the war. Apparently made themselves quite popular. Did a lot of performances, a lot of exhibitions, a lot of work for the charities of the time and the bonds. And this, again, a beautiful, beautiful photograph of students out sketching. I think it's a somewhat posed photograph, but it's very, very good, isn't it? Look at this, taking a Tarn rig, wherever it's been taken there. Gilbert hated it. He hated the landscape. Mountains weren't his thing. He felt discomforted by the fact where were the soft shires of southern England, where was all his familiar walks. Remember when he's in Tree Cottage or at Burden's farmhouse, he would put his bag to his easel, his canvas, and he would walk, and the prospect would open in front of him, and it would be familiar. It would be an agricultural environment, and he would feel comfortable. Up here, he just threw him completely. So he loathed the disruption, he loathed the leadership. The letters are vitriolic, they're great to read, but it's very uncomfortable because clearly he was not a very, very easy companion. I mean, I run a university with 1,000 staff. I used to run a part of a university with 4,000 staff. I would not have liked to have had Gilbert Spencer amongst my staff because he was a grumbler, there's no doubt about it. Maybe he had lots to grumble about, I don't know. But he, all the same, put that to one side and did some sublime paintings of the period. The one on the left here, it's in Bradford. Again, it does that kind of balancing act between serious and humorous in the way that his brother could do as well. Stanley was wowed by these paintings. He thought that this painting here, which is a beautiful composition, troops going from left to right, cows slightly in front of them, forming this kind of strange chevron effect there. And I think he thought that was the most touching image of the cows, almost like parading alongside. But he was not very happy, but at the same time, it did fuel his art in very, very notable ways. The paintings on the right, despite the fact that he found the landscape quite uncomfortable, he was not used to this kind of shape, this kind of colour or tonality, he still produced some very, very stunning images, I think, of gardens, market gardens, allotments. He was always drawn to them, and then of particular trees, a beautiful painting of a tree there. Something happened in the kind of quality of his painted touch. I think there's a kind of feathery touch there, there's something a bit softer, the focus changes, but he was capable again of drawing with great clarity. I think this is a really quite You know, when you think of what was happening in English surrealism at the time, I think there's something in there that is really quite a striking, ghost-like composition. We've seen as well in some of the illustrated letters that Gilbert was capable of the most humorous caricatures and cartoons. And light of touch, he did a whole series of rather large watercolour paintings of the Home Guard. They're in the kind of tradition of Bruce Bairnsfather, you know, a better old to go to, you know, Old Bill and all that. And these ones here, which is, this is the title anyway, if you can't see it, it says, "It is urged on all ranks to make the fullest use of local conditions when adopting protective covering." So they're using the sheep unknowingly to make sure that they're not getting shot at. I think for him, being in the Home Guard was endless high jinks, actually. You know, taking offence and bombarding or ransacking buildings that didn't exist, whatever. They kept themselves busy. So he put together 12, 14 of these. They're going to be shown next week in Ambleside. The show at Kendal that we're doing is really about his time in the north of England. There are other paintings as well. So Gilbert was really pleased with these, very proud of these, and thought I would show them in London. He sent them off to London, and they were packaged up. They never made it very far. They made it to the local post office. The postmaster opened them, was deeply kind of irked what he or she saw, felt that they were in conflict for the Defence of the Realm Act, and then ripped them in half. So each of the watercolours has a big rip, like this, ripped down that, and returned to him. Gilbert, you know, quick to irascibility, was angry, but actually he was more frightened than angry. It didn't just dawn on him that, you know, it was existential time for the British Empire. It was also something deeply personal. He was very, very concerned for his family, very concerned for the students he wanted to be with at a time of crisis, felt abandoned in the north of England, and then for his paintings that clearly as an artist you have great passion for your work, to have officials, and the Spencer family did not like officialdom, bailiffs, policemen. They felt very, very difficult amongst authority. This scared him, but not for long, because the paintings were patched up and they're still in circulation. The war ends, and Gilbert comes back to what he hopes will be a kind of normality. He walks straight into the Darwin years at the Royal College of Art. Lord Darwin, Robin Darwin, extraordinary character, had arrived at the Royal College of Art when it was at its nadir. It was just not fulfilling its mission, which was to drive the highest quality of design, which would then benefit British manufacturing across the empire. And Darwin came along, and there was a complete cull of most of the staff. In fact, the one artist who survived was John Nash. And as on record, Darwin said, we'll give Nash another chance. We'll give him another chance. But everyone else went. There's a famous story, which is hard to prove, but I've been told by the official historian, that Gilbert played along for a while with Darwin, thinking, oh, he's a zealous man. He's a change agent. He's going to bring about what's needed here. But there were some moments of deep discomfort where an administration took over that Gilbert was clearly not prepared for. Gilbert still led a life where he was paid for 5 days a week, but thought doing 2 days teaching was enough. 2 days was enough, because you can't compromise a respectable artist, can you really? And you know, that does happen still, but I must admit, I think most people who are being paid as full-time professors would be in there. What was interesting, of course, is the painting school was not quite as lively as the design school. So across in design, you had Paul Nash, had been working there, Edward Borden, you had Evelyn Dunbars, you had Eric Ravilius, a very dynamic design environment. Most of those moved on and left. Gilbert apparently was in the bathroom, in the toilet, and Darwin walked in, and when they both left, Gilbert was out of a job. So he was sacked, more or less, summarily. And there is evidence, and I've got the letters that show it. And people like Carol Waite, very honourable artist, Carol Waite, who was also about to teach there at the time, expressed great sadness at the way they felt Gilbert had been treated. But to a degree, the pressure from government and from the Minister of Education on Darwin was, make the changes, you will have our complete authority. And he did. So off goes Gilbert. But again, he lands, he's the luckiest man alive, because another colleague of his, Douglas Bliss, who's working in Glasgow, gets him a job in Scotland. Glasgow School of Art, another leading organisation. Meantime, he's still making these extraordinary paintings. I think there's another wonderful painting of Peggy Hill, curious painting, an amalgamation of these figures moving up and down this street. Again, a bit of writing here just to tell you what was happening at the moment. You've got Stanley over here, you've got Gilbert here. In 1950, Gilbert's elected as an ARA, another, acclamation, very important. He'd off at Glasgow, made into an ARA. He exhibited 3 canvases, including this remarkable painting here of the school on Peggy Hill. Gilbert's hoping to make a great impression at the Royal Academy. So he's anticipating a favourable reaction, a critical reception, new works, instantly disappointed. Guess why? Star of the show is none other than Stanley, returning in triumph to the Academy after a 15-year absence. So Stanley suddenly appears, it's me again, and rejoins the institution as an academician, overshadowed the entire exhibition, a whole room virtually dedicated to Stanley's work, and it's the resurrection at Port Glasgow, this vast canvas of 2 metres tall. So Gilbert's somewhat put out, hoping to make a big impact at the Academy. Now he's an ARA, and Stanley just sat there in the middle of the clamour and the acclaim. But to his credit, and to a reporter he wrote, said, "I'm very pleased that my resurrection paintings from Glasgow have been so well received, but I'm even more pleased that my brother is now an ARA." So it wasn't quite a footnote, it was something of real recognition. I think what's interesting as well is the write-ups of the time. I was trying to explore what happens in the 30s and 40s when they're reviewed in the papers. Are they always Gilbert and Stanley Spencer? Is it always John and Paul Nash, or are they seen as separate? To a degree, they were seen as separate, actually. And this is from the Liverpool Daily Post. It's a bit vindictive in many ways. But Gilbert evidently has a genuine love of the English countryside, and he manages to achieve some delightful plein air effects, which is very typical of the kind of reviews. Many, many reviews he would have. Quiet, well-mannered landscapes, which is kind of faint praise, but it's all right, isn't it? And then continues, as different from his disturbed brother's work. So Gilbert exists by comparison with Stanley, not only for a while, because actually they're seen as different, but Stanley was going through his own trials at the Royal Academy under Munnings, etc. at the time. But again, the range of work, I mean, this most sublime landscapes, beautifully seen landscapes. I'm doing a project at the moment with a colleague, Amy Lim, and we're trying to do a complete catalogue of all of Gilbert's work. It's a massive job. No one's done it before. It may be published at the moment, it's going to be online. Amy has now worked out there are 435 oil paintings, which is many more than we'd expected. A lot of them have similar titles, a lot of them we don't have images of, but we're doing our best to work through those 435. We're working on the oils at the moment. So, getting towards the end, people, another 6 or so slides just to give you a sense of pace here. Apologies if I'm moving quite quickly. It's hard to put down 70 years of somebody's life in a number of slides, but I'm trying to give you snapshots of each of them. I mentioned earlier on that Gilbert was a very, very good humorist, a caricaturist, and these are some of the images and postcards he sent to his family from Glasgow or from other parts. They're very telling, very small, and almost impossible to read. I cannot tell you, I've looked at letters he wrote when he was in his 15, 16 years old in beautiful copperplate. They are just stunning. They look like it took an hour to write each page. By the age of 50s, maybe 60s, certainly as he got older, I struggled to read whole pages of them. And you read difficult writing. You get your eye in and you think, I'm going to get this. Well, I'm transcribing all the letters at the moment, and there's a lot of gaps and question marks, but we get there. Anyway, apologies. So there's Gillian up there, receiving these letters. By this time, she's at Badminton School in Bristol, where Unity had also been, and there are 5 or 6 paintings in their collection. I've seen them. Unity's paintings, some wonderful drawings by Stanley, and a beautiful landscape, a stunning landscape by Gilbert, which is very, very good that they're all there. So, moving on. 1960, he becomes a full academician. He goes out and gets a formal photograph taken, writes to one of his friends saying, look, it's about time, I really ought to get a decent photograph taken of me. And there he is, looking very handsome. I even found here his invitation to the coronation of the Queen Elizabeth II, in Hyde Park in 1952. You had to pay for it. It was £6. Seems quite a lot of money, £6. I have no idea what that is now. And lots of illustrated letters like this, written in, that's to Florence. I can read that quite well from 1950s. And more paintings based on places he knew. This is Hook End Farm. And also these kind of strange, cryptic kind of relationship between people, man and a woman here talking to what looks like an agricultural labourer or a landowner. Again, the most beautiful chickens and poultry. Poultry in motion, hey, they really is very, very good. Very good indeed. That's in Bristol Art Gallery. I spent a privileged 2 hours with it not long ago, just sitting in front of it in the archives thinking, goodness me, this is a thrill. Get it out and let people see it, because this is good work. This is very, very good work. And then commissioned, there's a whole chapter in the book set aside for the vexatious vex relationship between the Royal Academy and Gilbert. For some reason, he liked picking fights with people. Perhaps he was right to do so, but Tom Monington and some of the others, Hugh Casson, they all seem fairly honourable people, but Gilbert seemed to take slight at some of the issues, the elections, the selections, where his work was hung, what was said to him, what wasn't said. A picture got lost in the RA collection, etc. And by way of response, and the correspondence is voluminous, and I have to thank Alice Strickland, one of my colleagues who helped the early stages of the book, and she did a huge amount of work in the Academy photographing vast amounts of minutes. God, thank God for minutes of meetings. There's so much information in them, and for letters. Gilbert was commissioned to make this remarkable painting, which you can walk into the RA, into the restaurant. It's there, up above you. I was enjoying more than one glass at the William Kentridge show a couple of years ago, and looking at this painting, thinking, it's lovely to have a glass of whatever it was in my hand, watching this painting. And this is again an autobiographical painting. There are others like this that Gilbert painted on a mural scale. And this is that mural scale of his. You can see there's the Cookham High Street. There's the movement across as a painter, as a young painter. There's imagery there from his childhood. There's the National Gallery. This is the success story, the procession of an artist who started with very little, who was 13 months older than his very, very famous older brother, in a family of 9 who were an extraordinary family, and he somehow had to carve his own way. And this painting summarises that remarkable journey that he made and kept making and sustained it over many, many decades. It can't have been easy being an artist. It can't have been easy bringing up a family and having his everything going for him. We're reaching the end of the 50s, early 60s. Gillian is married. This is Caroline and Kathy. This is an extraordinary moment. We have them over here. Here they are as bridesmaids. Well done. There's a long story which you could share about being dressed for those. This is Gillian, first of 3 marriages, cutting from, and you will know this, Michael, you will know this church, St Andrew's in Upper Barfield here. And look at the painting. This is his diploma painting for the Royal Academy. Gilbert was at his best at that point where the hinterland, where gardens, allotments go into raw nature, or at least agricultural nature and landscape, was always at his best. Always at his best with gates. In one section of the book, I write about a couple of watercolours he made of gates, as if he was just physically made it. So chicken coops, gates, barriers, divides, ways of moving into the painting. And, you look at these paintings, there's very few paintings, painters could make that kind of tracery of branches and twigs against this kind of sullen sky, a bit like the sky we had today. And look what was happening around him. Look what was happening at this time. The period of family crisis, that his wife died in a very short period, from illness to death in Reading, movingly written in his autobiography. 6 months later, Stanley dies. And within weeks, he has Victor Gollancz writing to him, and I've got the letters saying, you need to write that book about your brother. He's elected as an academician. Gollancz is on his back straight away. I need that book. I need the book now. I need it tomorrow. Partly because Victor Gollancz knew there was a book in this, a book from his brother, from Gilbert, about Stanley, and he wanted it out before Maurice Collis got his out. So publishers classically trying to fight for each other for shelf space. 61, Gillian married, and in 64, he's an artist who never really had an exhibition of all their work in one place. 1964, his regional gallery, the Reading Art Gallery Museum, said, we will stage a show of your work. They even put a little advert in the Telegraph, which went nationally, saying, if you have a Gilbert Spencer painting, please, will you let us have it, because we're collecting it. They put a battle bus together and went around the country gathering all the paintings. 130 paintings, a big show. There were wagon carts, many, many drawings. And Gilbert was insistent. He said, it's not just a retrospective, it's called the retrospective. They kept scoring it out, the retrospective. And it was impressive. A lot of work was bought, a lot of good reviews, and maybe not as major as he was hoping, not at national level, but regionally he did very, very well from it. And it looks splendid, there's no doubt about it. And here he is, towards the end of his life, on his own, Gillian working in London, Peter still estranged, trying to make contact in many ways, but Gilbert still finding it very difficult to face up to what his young adult life had been like, but endlessly industrious. A wonderful painting there, which is owned by someone in the room here, by Michael here and Colette, I saw quite recently, a beautiful painting. Again, probably done within 250, 300 yards of where he lived. And then at the same time, hugely industrious. Not one book, but two books came out in the 60s and then into the 70s. And the catalogue, that's a catalogue of the show, heavily handwritten. When you go into his catalogues, he has a habit of writing next to his paintings what he thinks about them. Good. Good. All right. You know, so he tends to write across them. But by this time, he was being collected, he was being shown at the New Grafton Gallery. 1974, Peyton Skipwith, young manager of the Gallery at Fine Arts Society, puts together a show, very, very difficult show. Peyton I interviewed for the book and said it wasn't the easiest thing. Gilbert was very insistent about the way it was going to be shown, but a beautiful show. 1974, folks, 1974, that was the last outing. What is it? 2024, it's the last publication. The last, piece of published work 50 years ago. It's extraordinary, isn't it? 1974, there he is. That's the painting. It's in the Royal Academy. And finally, we're getting towards the very, very end now. There's a rather beautiful photograph that was reproduced taken by Barnett Seidman and reproduced in a number of newspapers. It tells us so much, doesn't it? Stanley is talking. Characteristically, pointing, making a point. Gilbert is looking down and pondering. Maybe pondering, what the hell is Stanley talking about? Or he's thinking, ought I to kind of make some sort of reply? The relationship between the brothers never really changed in many ways. And I love this here. This is a draft page in the autobiography, chapter 1. And up here we have a palette, the memoirs of a brother brush. And there's Gilbert and there's Stanley coming out. And there's a story back in that previous painting about one of the brushes representing Stanley. I have always regarded myself as some kind of a miracle. Full stop. Like that at the end there. And there's I walked past that today. I was looking at it thinking, where did Barnett Seidman take that photograph? Literally right in front of there. What a tragic end, but also what a glorious one in many ways. And then from his memorial service, which was in the Royal Academy's church at Piccadilly, this is from John Ward, the Royal Academician, who was one of his students at the Royal College of Art, who said, in a 10 or so page, handwritten, many, many changes, I have copies of it, Gilbert was always anxious to have the ordinary man's opinion, as he was to have that of the expert. You don't have to know the country to see with what dear skill and care he drew and painted his trees and his houses and carts. And indeed, part of his originality lies in his ability to put into a painting an attitude which might have come from the man who built the cart, ploughed the field, or drove the farm implement. It says so much about the integrity and the sense of affinity that Gilbert had for the labourer, for the farm worker, for the agricultural worker, that he felt an affinity, perhaps never requited, but he wanted to suffuse his art with it. And I love this final bit. Nothing was just ever a shape, a tone. Everything was something which he could love for itself. One of the things I remember most is Gilbert had very little room for the kind of modernism, for abstract work. He could not stomach the kind of arguments made by certain modernist writers or modernist art historians. When Herbert Reed joined the meetings with the Carlines in Hampstead, Gilbert stopped going. Just didn't like that kind of level of intellectual pontification, much more practical, down-to-earth individual. And when I was putting the book together, I had lots of phone calls with those who knew Gilbert. And it's amazing when you're writing, because you're reading these letters, wondering, is that written with irony in mind? Is it written comically? Is it written dead seriously? You have to ask the most basic things. Did he drive? Did he smoke? I can't tell you the amount of people who told me he didn't smoke. And every photograph I have, he's got a cigarette in his hand. So it's interesting what comes back to you. By the early 70s, there comes a point, I guess, in the maturing life of any artist, you say, I'm not painting anymore, I can't paint, I'm not doing what I want to do. Stop painting, decided to sell up Tree Cottage, and the Martineau family, who'd been very, very kind to him, looked after him, Catherine Martineau, Cash Martineau as she was known, more or less took him under her wing, and he lived in an annex to their house in Suffolk, and led a very quiet last few years. Painting and being a painter was the best thing in the world. I thought that was such a lovely thing to finish on. You good people. Born in Cookham, born here, extraordinary, 4th of August, the day of the outbreak of war many years later, 1892, died in Essex, 14th of January. Now, I think that's a very powerful phrase to finish on, but I wanted to finish on an even more powerful phrase, a photograph I was sent last week, which I found so moving, and I just wanted to share it with you, and I asked Kathy's permission. I'm going to ask Caroline permission too, to show this photograph here. The best thing in the world is family. So this is Caroline, and that is, it just almost reduces me to tears almost. It's an extraordinary image. Date would be about 52, 53, 1952, 53, about then. A bit later. 56, sorry, 56 you were saying. And there's Gilbert in front of paintings as yet unidentified. I know this painting here, that's of the flower show, which we've seen. That will be shown next week in the Lake District. These paintings I'm still trying to work out. And quite what Caroline's doing now and what she's about to paint, who knows. But thank you very much indeed.